Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the New Ground Life and Leadership podcast. Today, it is a treat and an honor to be joined by Professor Nancy Pearcey. Professor Pearcey is the author of several best-selling books, including, I've got some of them here, Total Truth, Love Thy Body, and this one released recently. It's titled The Toxic War on Masculinity, subtitle How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Professor Pearcey, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. It's good to be here.
Wonderful. Well, it was lovely talking before we started recording, just hearing about all the amazing work you're doing, the classes you teach on Houston Christian University, which I'd love to find out a little bit more about as we go. But today I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about the content of your book, Toxic War on Masculinity. I'd love that if we could just start by considering the changing attitude towards men and masculinity as outlined in your book. In other words, how were men and masculinity thought about in different cultures and at different periods in history?
Well, the reason it's become problematic today is that it's become socially acceptable to attack men quite viciously. One of the first headlines that I saw that told me this is a problem is the Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And a Huffington Post editor tweeted #KillAllMen, as if that were a joke. Another joke, by the way, was so many men, so little ammunition. You can buy t-shirts with that slogan. And there are books out with incredibly blunt titles like I Hate Men and No Good Men and Are Men Necessary? And even some men are jumping on the bandwagon. A fairly well-known male author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. So, well, and I'll give you one more example because this was in the news not too long ago. So it's not in the book, it's more recent, but the director of the movie Avatar was in the news for saying, his name is James Cameron. He said, testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. And so it's not surprising that surveys are now showing that about half of Western men, there was a survey in America, a survey in Britain, and both cases, about half of American men said, society seems to punish men just for acting like men these days. So I thought this is what I want to understand. How can we get to the bottom of this? Where is this incredible hostility coming from? And so that was the first reason I wanted to write the book, is just, you can't stand against a social trend unless you know where it came from and how it developed. So there's a good bit of history just saying, well, where did concepts of masculinity come from? How did they develop? And in particular, how did they get more and more secular? Because the definitions that people don't like tend to be the secular definitions of masculinity. And so I wanted to contrast that with the biblical view of masculinity.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, you do this in the first few chapters of the book. You talk about the difference between a good man and a real man. Do you mind expanding that for us?
Yeah, I really jumped on this because it was a sociological study. So this is not my own idea. But I put it at the front of the book because, to tell you the truth, to my surprise, this is the most controversial book I've written. I really thought Love Thy Body would be, right? Because it deals with issues like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, which are still really hot button issues. But at least in the Christian world, this was more controversial. The word masculinity is such a trigger word that when I was writing the book, I always have a lot of reading groups. That's my key to finding all the rough edges of a manuscript. And when they would tell their friends and family about it, invariably the first question was, whose side is she on? Not like you have to have a side. Most men simply assumed that a female writing a book on masculinity would be a male bashing feminist, which I'm not. And more progressive types tended to think, well, she's probably, reactionary, defensive, culture warrior type, which I'm not either. So I put this study at the beginning of the book because it sort of helped overcome that initial suspicion. So a sociologist named Michael Kimmel speaks all around the world. And so he came up with this clever experiment where he would ask young men, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're in a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? And the sociologist said all around the world, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately start listing things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy. I kind of like that one. Be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. And the sociologist would ask them, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, I don't know. It's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage.
Mm.
And then he would follow up with a second question. He'd say, what does it mean if I say man up? Be a real man. Except he used coarse language. And the young men themselves would say, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And so the sociologist concluded that this is really interesting, that men everywhere, because this was global, around the world, men seem to understand what the good man is. This is an innate, inherent, universal awareness. I mean, I would say we're made in God's image. And so as a result, men do have this innate knowledge of what it means to be the good man. And when we ask them to live up to biblical standards, we're not imposing something alien on them. We're coinciding with our own best knowledge. Their conscience, Romans 2, right? We all have a conscience. We do know right from wrong. But young men are reporting that they also feel pressure to live up to the quote unquote real man. And those traits are quite different. So, I mean, they're not all bad, tough and strong. But if they are disconnected from a moral vision, they can slide into entitlement, dominance, sexual promiscuity, get rich, get laid. So I use that throughout the book then as sort of a guiding thread. Like how did we lose the good man? How did our culture come to embrace the real man? And it's also, I think, a better way to approach these issues because men don't respond very well to being called toxic. Nobody would. But what we can do then is can we affirm and support and encourage them in this innate knowledge of what it means to be the good man. And that gives us a much more positive way to approach these issues.
Oh, it's real. And that comment about the good man is a universally kind of understood idea. I think I've seen you tweet about this since the book came out as well, with showing yet more evidence that people from around the globe acknowledge these aspects of positive masculinity. So where does that come from? You say it's just a kind of an innate thing that God's put in us. Is it? I would have thought that the way we think about masculinity would have been so shaped by Christ that we would have had a particular slant on it in the West.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I do go into more detail in the book on what's distinctively Christian, but I think it's very encouraging to recognize that it's like a creational given. Here's another study. So this was by an anthropologist. And again, it was global. And he was looking specifically at concepts of masculinity cross-culturally. And he found that no matter how different the cultures were, they all shared a common code of manhood. And he called it the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate, meaning become a father, build into the next generation. And I thought, there it is again. That there does seem to be, men are made in God's image. They do have an inherent sense of at least the basic understanding of that their unique masculine strengths were not given them just to get what they want, but to serve and help others. Because we have to acknowledge men are bigger, stronger, faster. This is, speaking of creational givens, this is just how God made men. 75% greater upper body muscle mass, 90% greater upper body strength. And because of testosterone in general, they're more aggressive and risk-taking. They even have more fast twitch muscles. That's a word I had to learn. It means they can react more quickly. And so we have to, it's important that we say these are good. When we're in a society where masculine strengths are being said to be bad and evil and this, the source of oppression and patriarchy, it's important that we acknowledge that, no, God made men this way. And these surveys are showing that men do intrinsically, inherently know that those strengths were given them to protect, provide for, and if necessary, fight for the people that they love.
So I loved so much about your book, and what I really love is how much you're able to kind of reach back into history as well and show how different cultures and societies have related to and thought about the creational differences between men and women. So hasn't always been the case in the West, at least, and certainly in other cultures, that people have thought about masculinity in such a way that we are in our particular cultural moment. So I'd just love to get your reflections and comments on how you think men and masculinity have been treated in different cultures and different times in history.
Yeah, well, in my book, I stay primarily with the U.S., just to put limits on it so the book isn't too big. But it also made it a little easier because the U.S. was perhaps, because of the First and Second Great Awakenings, was the most religious nation, even in the Western world, the most Christian. And of course, we were founded by Puritans. So I go back to before the Industrial Revolution. Before that, men worked alongside their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectations at the time focused much more on their caretaking role. Here's a fun fact. Most books on child rearing back then were addressed to fathers. Today you go in a bookstore, they're mostly addressed to mothers. But fathers were thought to be the primary parent, and fathers did, in fact, spend as much time with their children as mothers did. That's hard for us to even imagine. And even secular historians, I love it. One historian puts it this way: the definition of masculine virtue was duty to God and man. Duty. So, question is, how did we lose that? And it was twofold. It was economic, and of course, it was the secularization of Western culture. Economically, what happened is the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. Men had to follow their work out of the home into offices and factories, and for the first time, they were not working alongside family members, people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And already in the 19th century, you see people start to complain, protest that men were changing, that they were losing that caretaking ethos of the colonial era. They were becoming individualistic, self-interested, egocentric, greedy, and acquisitive, to use the language of the 19th century. And many complained that men were starting to turn their career into an idol. I was amazed at how often people use that word. Because before then, you worked within the family unit. It was obvious you were working for your family. But now men began to think more in terms of, no, I'm working for my own, financial success, my own career achievement. The mentality began to shift. And that shift was reinforced by the fact that also after the Industrial Revolution, there arose a huge public sphere. There was not a sharp public-private divide before that, when economic work was done in the home. But now they developed these large factories and businesses and financial institutions and universities and, of course, the state. And people began to argue that these large public institutions should be run by scientific principles. But what they really meant was value-free. Don't bring your personal values into the public realm. And which is what we hear today still, right? That was the beginning of that. And since men were working in the public arena and getting that secular education, they did become secular before women did. And so a lot of the negative traits that we associate now to certain types of masculinity, that's where they started. And again, you can see in the literature of the day, because men were no longer governing their behavior by biblical principles as much, historians all agree that there was a huge increase in drinking, gambling, fighting, gang activity, and prostitution. And so men's behavior did very objectively grow worse as impact of Christianity was lessened in the public square. So the twofold, on the one hand, men being disconnected from their family, and then secondly, the secularization of our public life.
Oh yeah, it's really helpful. I remember actually you saying that reminds me of I spoke to Dr. Danielle Treweek on this podcast, who's written a book on
Yeah, I
singleness.
saw that.
Yeah, she's a wonderful lady, and she, in a lecture I heard her give, made this observation about the Puritan era, that the wives and the pastors, at least, were very concerned about the men going out of the home to work. They considered going into the world of work as being quite dangerous. It's the domain of darkness and Satan, and so they would urge their wives, their women, to pray for their men as they went out, and they saw it very much as this kind of sacrificial leaving the place of safety, if you like, and out into the world of work, which was corrupting because it was built around those themes of dominance and competition, and it was just pursuing mammon at the very least, which I think that attitude towards the working world does seem to be almost have disappeared now. It's your work and your career is the place you go to be fulfilled or to self-actualize, and there doesn't seem to be as much concern about people being corrupted by the world, at least, and the competition, the competitive nature of work. Would you agree with that? Would you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the days of early industrialization, it was pretty dark, and children were, going out to work too when they were working in the factories and so on. And I wrote about when the workday was reduced to 10 hours and then to 8 hours. Wait, what? What was it originally? It was 16 hours in many factories.
Wow.
And a lot of the laws that we think were motivated by religion were actually motivated to get fathers home, like the 8-hour day, but also like Sunday laws. We thought that was motivated by Christians wanting Sunday worship, but actually, many of the people who argued in the 19th century was we need fathers to have a day home. When men first started going out to work, we're so used to it, fathers being gone all day, but it was a shock. It was a huge shock at the time. I quote a Parents magazine, 1842. The author said, "The greatest source of domestic sorrow today is that fathers are gone from weekend to weekend." The head of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement wrote, "Our fatherhood has become a Sunday institution. They're not there during the week." The leading psychologist of the day said, "Our boys are half orphaned, because, the father's gone most of the day. And so our boys are growing up without that masculine presence in their life anymore." And so, it was a real shock. Adding to, and that's just the father being gone. And in fact, people began to complain that boys were becoming wild and unruly because their fathers were not supervising them anymore. And that added to the 19th century breakdown of behavior as well, because these unsupervised boys who were becoming wild and rowdy as they grew up, and they went into the cities, they also then were more prone to the vices in the city, like drinking and gambling and prostitution. Sometimes a single historical fact can crystallize it. So in 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So public drunkenness was a real problem. People falling down drunk in the alleys. So that's why we had a temperance movement. A lot of the reform movements of the 19th century grew up in order to counter what were essentially male vices. In other words, I'll give you one quote. So this is from a feminist historian, but she said, all of the reform movements of the 19th century were implicit condemnations of males. There was no doubt as to the sex of the tavern keeper, the slave master, the drunkard, and the seducer. And so there was also another dimension of this, is the tension between men and women, as women were essentially called to be the ones who maintained the home. The home became the place, like you said a moment ago, that was safe. That was the realm where you could still live out Christian values and Christian virtues. And women were, for the first time, by the way, first time ever in human history, women were said to be morally superior to men. And so the men would come home at night and they were supposed to be reformed, refined, and renewed by their morally superior wives. So that was the dynamic of the 19th century. And I would say it's kind of the Me Too movement. I mean, we still see it, right? We still see many times that women are kind of seen as the ones who have to hold men in check. It's the men who are more likely to be violent and rude and sexually promiscuous, blah, 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 which I disagree with, but that's kind of the understanding, and that it's women who have to hold them, hold the line morally and try to control men. But this all grew out of the 19th century.
Can I ask a question about what you just said there? You said, I disagree with that idea then that men are, sorry, pick up on that men are more likely to act violently or sexually promiscuously. Talk to me, if you don't mind, what's behind that?
Well, I go through several stages of the secularization of society's view of masculinity. And one of the most important ones is the rise of Darwinian evolution. And that was a bit of a surprise because most people think that's just about science, biology. But it actually had a huge impact on cultural views of masculinity, because Darwinian writers began to say that the men who won out in the struggle for survival would be the ones who were ruthless and brutal and savage, barbarian and predatory. Instead of urging men to live up to the image of God in them, they began to say, oh no, just live down to your animal nature. The beast within was their favorite phrase. And this was, by the way, not just historical. It's come back in a big way. Social Darwinism now goes by the name of evolutionary psychology. The idea that if our bodies evolve, so did our minds and all our ideas. And one of a best-selling book on the subject is called The Moral Animal. And the author says, the human male is a possessive, oppressive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving him a book on how to have a better marriage is like giving a Viking a book on how not to pillage. And I thought, really, you can get away with demeaning men like this? But this was his evolutionary perspective. And there's a new one. Well, it's not new. It's an older book that's just been reissued, which you may know because it has been around a while. George Gilder's book, Men in Marriage. And he too says, by nature, men are violent, irresponsible, and sexually predatory. The greatest yearning is to escape civilization, to a primal mode of immediate gratification. Well, I disagree with this because I don't think this is a biblical view of manhood. I don't think we have to say, we don't equate manhood with their sin. It is true that men maybe have certain characteristic sins and women have other sins that are more characteristic. But I think what these definitions do is that they equate men with their sin and say, well, this is just the male nature, put up with it. It's the Andrew Tate phenomenon, right? Andrew Tate has become...
Yeah. I was going to ask you about Andrew Tate. Yeah. I was going to ask you a bit about Andrew Tate. Because
Go ahead.
I think my observation of Andrew Tate is he seems to be a reaction to, like, he's giving voice to a reaction of males that feel, what's the word I'm looking for? Demeaned and constantly told that they're the problem. So people like that who feel constantly overlooked and demonized by society have found someone in Andrew Tate that they are looking to help them. But he seems to be drawing from the real man script almost entirely for what makes for positive or effective and good masculinity. So I'd just love to get your reflections on why you think Andrew Tate's become the phenomenon he is and what you think we should do about it.
Yeah. So someone summarized Andrew Tate as fast cars, fast money, fast women. So I thought that was a good way of putting it. And he has, I have seen him in interviews call himself a pimp, quite openly, and say that what he produces is pornography. Andrew Tate, let me tell you where that started. Toward the end, so the 19th century was an era of a lot of these reform movements, right? And the reform movements were trying to counter these male vices that had become so much more prevalent in the 19th century. Drinking, well, that's the temperance movement, gambling, fighting, the abolition movement, slave masters taking sexual advantage of female slaves. that was the heart of much of the rhetoric. We've forgotten that, but that was one of the major arguments people made at the time. And of course, there was something called the social purity movement, which was against prostitution and sex trafficking. But what happened is, of course, many of these reform movements were led by women, and they were addressing male vices. So what happened? By the end of the 19th century, men began to rebel. They began to say, stop, blaming and accusing us. What you just said a minute ago actually started back in the late 19th century. Men began to say, well, maybe that's just our nature. Maybe men are just by nature lewd, rude, and crude, and leave us alone. That was the beginning of the Andrew Tate phenomenon. Stop telling us that men's sins are so particularly bad. Or we're just going to turn around and say, this is who we are. And that's what happened. The secular script was around there for them to pick up. And so they said, look, the Darwinian script, we're ruthless and barbarian, and that's just who we are. And so Andrew Tate is just finally where that has come to the fore. He's become perhaps right now the most influence, the largest influencer on the manosphere. The manosphere is those online men's rights groups. And he openly says, he's not going to get married. And even if he did, his wife cannot expect him to give up other women, because men are just like that. Men are just naturally that way. And he's been followed now by somebody named Myron Gaines, who has been heralded by the New York Post as the new Andrew Tate. And his tagline is, I help men turn from simps into pimps. And he says, he says openly, you should never get married, because a woman can never expect, loyalty from a man. That would just be contrary to his nature. But that turning point was in the late 19th century, where men began to say, you're asking us to live up to these standards, and the social condemnation is so extreme that we're just going to say, this is who we are. That was when the turning point happened. And it's just now, over time, crystallized. I agree with you. It is a reaction, but it's a reaction to the 19th century reform movements, to be precise. And what it does mean, and I have to tell you, I talk to Christians who say they think it's the double standard is still in the church as well. I was interviewed by a young married couple who had their own podcast. And so I decided to turn the questions on them. And I said, what do you think in the church today among young people? Do you still have the double standard? And they said, absolutely. It's absolutely understood or assumed that men are more prone to sin and vice. Men are more prone to pornography and adultery and affairs. And it's women who have to hold them in line. It's women who have to hold up the moral standard, the moral ideal. And men's sin is always just threatening to break through, And if the woman does anything wrong, it's her fault if he goes and engages in porn, because, of course, that's more his nature. And so, anyway, their report was quite concerning, that it seems to be a dynamic that still young people are experiencing, even in the church.
It does seem to be there's almost like a perfect storm, isn't there, of coming together of different ideologies. You talk obviously about social Darwinism, Marxism with its emphasis on history being essentially oppressor and oppressed, but then also you've got Freud reducing us down to the libido and the necessity to satisfy our sexual instincts and urges. And then of course you get the permission from a lot of this to just indulge your sinful nature, we would call it, in the name of science. This is who you are. And there is this idea that men are just wild, need to be out in the wilderness, away from everybody else, or they're antisocial and all of that, which of course, I think there's a phrase you use in your book that men live down to your expectations of them. And it puts unfair and undue pressure then on the women in our lives to be messiahs or pure beings who can save males and reform them and transform them. Well, I loved so much of your book. As I mentioned, that there's a brilliant quote I'd love to read, because I'd love to talk a little bit about just some of the ways that stereotyping of men and women can be harmful. And we see this
Mm.
in the church, even I think in sometimes in the type of events that we run for men or for women appeal to these stereotypes, perhaps. But I love the I just want to read this quote if I can from C.S. Lewis. I always love finding a new C.S. Lewis quote, and and it turns out you shared with me earlier you teach a class on C.S. Lewis, which I'd love to learn more about. But C.S. Lewis writes this, that it is arrogance in us men to call frankness, fairness, and chivalry masculine when we see them in a woman, and it is arrogance in them, women, to describe a man's sensitiveness or tact or tenderness as feminine. Can you say a little bit about stereotypes, the differences or non-differences, if you like, between men and women?
Yes, I love that quote too, by the way. I don't think I've ever heard anyone quote that Lewis quote before. For him to say it's arrogance to have to have sexual stereotypes. Yeah, it is true. I mean, let's face it. Since the book on masculinity is about those things that are unique to men, it's important to start out by saying that men and women are more alike than they are different. If you take any character trait, you get a bell curve for men and you get a bell curve for women, and they overlap very closely. Even a trait like aggression, I was kind of surprised to find out, that they overlap so closely that there's a lot of women who are more aggressive than a lot of men. So the differences tend to be mostly at the extremes. And that's why 90% of prison inmates are male. They're at the extreme of aggression. So I do think it's important. It's easy for us to kind of, women are from Venus and men are from Mars. We almost get the impression that we're never going to find common ground, and that can be discouraging. So I think it's important to start by saying, no, every psychological trait that's been measured has been an overlap. If physical traits don't, physically men and women are different. And most of our psychological differences come from that. I mean, men are bigger, stronger, faster, and women's superpower is that they have babies. The main reason that feminists are so concerned, anyone, but especially feminists have been very concerned about acknowledging differences, is because as soon as you acknowledge a difference, people think one is less than. It's just human. We all do that. If you make a distinction, one's going to be less than. So it's very important, I think, that as we affirm that men and women are different, it's important to say that women's strengths are strengths, that those things that are unique to women are also strengths, that in most cultures, women spend a big part of their adult life having children. And they do, they score higher on tests of emotional intelligence. And I think that's partly learned behavior, because when you have a baby, it's very demanding, right? Raising a child, you have to be on call 24 hours a day. If the baby's in distress, you don't tell it later. You don't say, you don't scold it. You don't reason with it. You meet its distress immediately, no matter what you wanted to do. And so it builds enormous stores of patience and sensitivity to nonverbal cues because they're not speaking yet. And so I think that it's important for us to say that they become mama bears, right? Because they also have to be sensitive to threats in the environment to their children. And so in my book, I literally said, when women are strong nurturers, they reflect the character of God, just as men reflect the character of God, because after all, Genesis tells us they were both made in God's image. And I had people disagree with me on that. I had men basically say, no, women do not reflect the image of God in their character. So apparently that's the point that has to be made. Of course they do. They're made in God's image. And so what's unique to women is just as much the image of God as what's unique to men is the image of God, and needs to be respected and honored as a reflection of God's own character.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that you said something about our biological differences then are borne out psychologically. They have a psychological impact in large part, perhaps because of our learned behavior, because there's the section in your book where you say that not only are women more nurturing as a result of children, and the male brain changes if he's present and actively engaged. So actually, our idea that men should be going out to work and they're not as good at home as mums is actually a socially conditioned thing, because men have generally been out in the last 50, 60 years or 100 years. I haven't said that very well. Perhaps you can say that better for me.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, because it's one of my favorite parts of the book. So I am not averse to appealing to men's self-interest, right? That they actually benefit from having children, because typically we have kind of this notion that men have to be coerced and browbeaten, into being more involved with their families. I had a graduate student who was the head of the women's ministry in a large Baptist church here in Houston, and she said, on Mother's Day, we would hand out flowers and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we would scold the men and tell them to do better. So that kind of scolding doesn't really work. But what can work is the recent scientific data showing that, in fact, men benefit enormously from becoming fathers. It starts with certain neurons in the brain that get activated. One psychologist calls it the dad brain. The dad brain, that there are neurons that literally get activated only when you become a father. And also, one reason women have a little head start in bonding with a baby is because of the hormone oxytocin, which arises during pregnancy. And people always thought only women had that. Well, it turns out men also have oxytocin. It's in men, it's stimulated by the tactile sense. So they actually have to be holding, cuddling, and playing with their child. But when they do that, their oxytocin is going up. And so is the baby's, by the way. The baby's goes up. They're all together bonding when they have that kind of contact. And the most surprising thing I found, and this was the most recent finding too, an anthropologist found that men's oxytocin is going up all through the 9 months of his wife's pregnancy. Apparently no one ever thought to check a man's blood during his wife's pregnancy. But when they did, they found out that men are also being actively biochemically primed to be a full partner in the parenting team. And so, God has equipped men, biochemically to be involved fathers. And I do quote a lot of men, who were interviewed. One was a pastor who became a father later in life. And he said, I feel cheated. No one ever told me how fulfilling it would be to become a father. Why aren't people talking about this? So the men who do become fathers often are shocked, because the culture hasn't prepared them to understand how incredibly engaging, their relationship with their children would be.
Yeah, it's really helpful. I think the anthropological starting point that we use is so important, isn't it? If we use social Darwinianism as our anthropological starting point for what makes a man and what makes a woman, then we'll end up in one place. But what you do, and I think this is superb, I've not seen this before, you point out from the creation account that it was to the man and the woman that God said, fill the earth and subdue it. In other words, make culture. The cultural mandate was given to women as much as it was given to men. But it was also be fruitful and multiply. It was given to men as much as it was given to women. And men are called to be engaged fathers in their homes, and were made for that purpose from the beginning, just as women were called and made to be culture creators and subduers of creation. And that, I love that, because you bring out the importance of partnership, which I think is what seems to be lacking in so much of the conversation. It's about the differences and the fighting and the tensions. And is it the Industrial Revolution? Is it feminism? Is it the sexual revolution? What is it that's caused this tension? Well, let's go further back. And actually, our foundational text for our anthropology says that partnership was God's original plan in both the domestic and the productive spheres. Is there anything you'd comment on or add to that?
Well, yeah, because I have to tell you, half my students don't even know the term cultural mandate. And so it is something that we've got to be able to explain. And so I come back to it, I think 3 or 4 times in the book, because it's such an important counter to two things. It's an important counter to a kind of pietism that's reduced religion to going to church and having Bible studies. If that's the only thing you have to offer men, no wonder men don't go to church as often. Men right now, the average American church is probably similar in other Western countries, is 60% women, 40% men. And people have wondered, well, why is that? Well, most men are not drawn to sitting around a circle talking about your feelings about this verse in the Bible. So the cultural mandate gives men a much richer, fuller calling. And by the way, it's also counted to a second. There's a reaction in the Christian world too. It's not quite as bad as Andrew Tate, but it is. Men find their truest self by being wild. Getting out, like you said a moment ago, going out mountain climbing and hunting elk with a bow. Whitewater rafting, and nothing wrong with those things. But is it how you measure your masculinity? That's also a reaction to the 19th century. So to counter both of those, I go to the cultural mandate. The cultural mandate, for people who don't know what that means, it's the name given to the verse in Genesis. But God's created the first human couple, and what's the first thing He says to them? He tells them why He created them. What's your purpose? What's your job description as a human race? And He says, "Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth." And the language of Genesis is so streamlined that you can sort of unpack many layers of that. Be fruitful starts with the family. And as you noted, that's very important because a lot of men don't think that. But by the way, Margaret Mead, the very famous anthropologist, said, motherhood is natural, fatherhood is a cultural construct. Well, if you think that, and then you're surprised that men are not motivated to become fathers, no, it is natural because God gave the cultural mandate to men to start with, be fruitful and multiply. And of course, the family is historically the foundation for all the other social institutions. It becomes a tribe, a clan, a nation. And you need social institutions for particular purposes. Like you need a state, you need a church, you need a school, you need a marketplace. And so you can unpack that to say it means that men are responsible for creating all of these social institutions. It's a very rich understanding of our calling. And then, of course, subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So that has everything to do with, starting with agriculture, but mining and technology and inventing light bulbs and creating computers. And I always like to add composing music. One of my students once said, come on, composing music. And I said, well, I play the violin. What's the violin made out of? Wood. And what's the bow made out of? Horsehair. So all of the transcendent beauty we associate with music starts with harnessing the raw materials of nature. And so this is called the cultural mandate because what it says is human beings were given the job of creating cultures, building civilizations, making history. It's a much richer understanding. Now, that gives men, in particular, the scope to accomplish, to achieve, to have mastery, to have an influence, to have an impact. These are things that men maybe especially have a drive to do, and it's the cultural mandate that gives them the biblical basis for that very rich, full sense of purpose.
Yeah, that's really good. I think I think a lot of men would agree and find a lot of their purpose and value coming from that world of work and creation and productivity. I think what seemed to me to be fairly novel and fresh from what I read is that your argument that actually men are also can get that level of satisfaction and enjoyment from the home. From being an engaged dad. I talked to John Tyson recently about the importance of dads discipling their sons, and it's something I'm quite passionate about personally. I think the church has neglected this. We've hired youth workers and thought they can just look after our kids for us. I think no, we've got to get dads back engaged with discipling our sons rather than always just paying a youth worker. But that's perhaps a side issue. But as you talk about, go on.
Well, it's not a side issue because before you change the subject, one of the most interesting studies that I quote in the book is a 35-year longitudinal study. It won all kinds of awards on how families pass along their religious faith. And they found two surprising things. One, fathers matter more than mothers. If a father is a committed Christian, his kids are more likely to follow him. And the mother has an impact, of course, but the father has more impact. My female students, by the way, said, well, that's not fair. And I said, well, but it's a fact. I'm sorry. Fathers have influence whether they want to or not. But the second thing was that it only works if the fathers have a warm, loving relationship with their son. So that a father can be a pillar of the church, right, and a moral exemplar, and have perfect theology. But if he's perceived as cold and distant, his kids won't follow him. They won't. It depends on that warm, loving bond. And interestingly enough, that was reinforced on the secular side. There was a study done more on a more limited question of how do you produce masculine sons. So this was interesting. And he found the same thing. He found that the father's own masculinity didn't matter. Because some fathers are more out there, some are more gentle, some are more assertive. The father's own masculinity didn't matter. What mattered was the close, warm, personal, loving bond, because that was what gave a son the secure, stable sense of masculinity. So the studies are really putting the emphasis right where God puts it, on fathers.
Wow. I mean, maybe in mentioning that, we can comment a little bit about some of the stuff you share in the book as well about male headship in marriage and in the home, that a proper biblical understanding of that leads to, surprisingly, the best marriages in society. But perhaps you could talk a bit about headship as you understand that and the importance of having a biblical definition of that.
Yeah, so this is the most fact-based book I've written, and this part, for example, is based on sociological studies of Christian men. We've all heard the secular narrative is that Christian men are like Exhibit A of toxic masculinity. I'll give you just one quote. I found lots of them. But this was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. And so the social scientists were listening to this and saying, but where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And I quote some dozen or so different studies on Christian couples. And to everyone's surprise, including mine, they discovered that Christian men test out at the top in terms of being warm, loving, and engaged husbands and fathers. Their wives report the highest level of happiness with their husband's love and affection. Evangelical fathers spend the most time with their children, 3.5 hours per week more than secular men. They have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples. And to everyone's surprise, they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America. And so, well, let me give you a quote. Sometimes that really crystallizes it. The sociologist who did the largest study was Brad Wilcox. He's at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he writes in places like the New York Times. So this is a New York Times article. And he said, direct quote, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. And they focus on the wives, of course, because the idea that these marriages are oppressive to the wives. But the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And then he turns to his colleagues. Sociology is a very secularized discipline, and he says academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and against evangelicals in particular, because evangelical Protestant married men with children are consistently the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. So this is the data. This is not a pep talk from some religious leader. This is solid empirical data. This is evidence-based findings, and we should be very confident in bringing it into the public square, and also bringing it into our churches, to encourage Christian men who feel beaten down. When I told my class at Houston Christian University that I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So we need to bring this data into the church and help counter the negative stereotypes.
Well, it's interesting, masculinity being beaten out of us. I like even just unpicking exactly what that means. Well, I wonder if from one of the observations, and I'd love to get your comment on this, someone who would have observed this much more than me. Even in the brief amount of time that I've been a Christian, I've noticed that even the language of headship has fallen out of fashion and favor. And we have tried to change what headship means, and so it doesn't mean head, it means source, or it means this, or it means that. And the husband isn't the head of the wife in the way that we used to think of him anymore. That seems to have almost just gone, which has left Christian males with probably a less clearly defined or celebrated or even talked about vision of what their role is supposed to be in the home. And the call even for husbands to lead their wives responsibly and lovingly. You obviously plot a lot of the changes back to the Industrial Revolution and the change in society in the 19th century. It seems to me that from the 1960s, there does seem to be, particularly in the theological circles, a reaction against headship in the home, headship in the church, if you like. And I'm not necessarily wanting to get into the discussion about complementarity and egalitarianism. I think you managed to sound like both in the book at different points, which is wonderful. But I would love your observations on how you think the church and evangelical Christians think about headship in the past 50 years or so.
Well, on the one hand, you're right, I didn't deal with it in the book, but I explain why I didn't deal with it. Two of my top researchers said it doesn't seem to make a difference. So the first one was a sociologist, Brad Wilcox, who I've already mentioned. And he said, we in our findings, in our studies, we didn't find that the husband's gender theory, is how he put it. The husband's gender theory, whether he thinks a man's the head or not, didn't seem to have an impact on his wife's happiness. He could be complementarian, he could be egalitarian. They did one study, in fact, he and one of his colleagues, on egalitarianism per se, and they said the women weren't any happier. He said, you might expect it, right? You in our day and age where we think equality is so important, you would expect that an egalitarian marriage would be happier, but they did not find it. And there was an earlier study too that said part of it is because if you get into a strict 50-50 mindset, you're constantly comparing, did he do as much as I did? And so that may be why. That was from an earlier study. But the main point is that the studies have not shown that the husband's gender theory made a difference. The other I said there were two top researchers that I quoted. The other one was a psychologist. He's not a Christian. His name is John Gottman. He's considered the top marriage researcher in the country. And he said the same thing. He said, couples coming into my practice sometimes think the man should be in charge of the marriage, and sometimes they're more egalitarian. And he said, and here's how he put it, emotionally intelligent husbands have figured out the important thing, which is how to convey honor and respect to your wife. And your gender theory doesn't seem to be what really decides that. What does decide it, by the way, and this is again Brad Wilcox, he said what decides it is whether the husband puts his family first. If he has a family-centric value system, does he think the family is the most important thing in his life? Does he think the family is the foundational institution of society? Does he think that being in a Christian family means, sexual fidelity to his wife? All those things tend to cluster around a high view of the family more than anything else. People who didn't have a high view of the family were the ones who are more likely to have unhappy marriages. So that was so interesting because it was not the gender theory so much as family-centered values that made a difference.
And you mentioned that the man there, not because necessarily he's the more dominant member of the household, or would you say that he is? I guess you're saying it because it's more of a natural given that the woman is going to be family centered. It's unusual. Is that what you're saying?
Well, actually, I was just reporting on what he found. I guess that's
Okay.
when he reported his findings, he did say because the question was, if the question is phrased as what difference does it make whether a husband believes in male headship or whether the husband believes in egalitarianism? That was kind of how they framed it. And when they said, no, that doesn't make a difference, they said, well, what does? Well, it's the husband's focus on whether he focuses on the family, to coin a phrase. Does he focus on his family? Is that the most important thing in his life? Is that what he thinks is his most important calling before God? Is his family? So that's just how the research was phrased. And by the way, also, I have a whole chapter that's just surveys of Christian couples because I don't want to hear another theologian tell me what headship means. That's fine, but that was not my point. You see, I'm an apologist at heart, right? I want to defend Christianity against a secular culture. What is the secular culture saying? It's saying that the concept of headship is going to turn these men into overbearing, tyrannical, oppressive patriarchs. That's an empirical claim. Therefore, it needs an empirical answer. In other words, does it? Does that theology turn men into overbearing patriarchs? You have to look at the men. You can't look at what those leaders say they should be. You have to look at what they do, in fact, report. And that's what social scientists do. They go out and study the guys, and they study these couples, and they say, well, how do you work out headship in your family? In your male husband-wife relationship, what does it look like for you? Because they're asking, does this theology turn these men into monsters? And I was as blown away as anyone. I was when I read the actual survey results, quotations from these men and women. I was quite blown away by how loving and respectful they treated headship. Now, because these were theologically conservative couples, a majority did buy into complementarianism, but that was still not the question they were asking. They were asking, does the concept of male headship, make these men into monsters? And so that's some people have criticized the book because they wanted me to give like the theological answer, and they don't understand that I'm not engaging in these sort of in-house debates. And I don't want to. I want to answer the secular world. The secular world is saying Christians, because they believe in any form of male authority, they are going to have these unhappy marriages. It's going to be oppressive to women. And the facts just don't bear that out. The facts debunk it entirely.
That's really helpful and really, really, I think, important to stress, isn't it? It's like you said, it's an empirical study. You might not like to quote your student, I don't like that. Well, it's the facts, whether you like it or not. It almost doesn't matter. I think I'm conscious I've taken a lot of your time. I think I'll bring it into land because I'm very, very grateful. But I suppose one of the things you do point out is that conservative Christians who take the Bible seriously and recognize that headship properly applied is the imitation of Christ our head, who laid his life down. And the trouble is that headship and language of headship and Bible verses can be used and have been used in the past as almost a license for domestic abuse, which I'm not going to necessarily open up now because of time, but there's a whole section in your book on that. You yourself share your personal story, which I just found those chapters devastating emotionally, incredibly courageous on your part, really, really helpful and important, that I think people have to buy the book to read it and find out more about that. But just as we close, is there anything else that's on your mind or heart you'd love to share with us as we close and consider perhaps the application of a lot of this in our churches?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I think for balance, for the sake of balance, it is important for us to recognize that that nominal Christian men do not test out well. The first pushback I always get is, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? And so the social scientists did go back to the data, and they made that very important distinction between men who are, committed, authentic, attend church regularly, and men who on a survey like this might check the Baptist box, for example, but who actually don't attend church very often, if at all. And, in the West, we do have a lot of these cultural Christians, that people who identify as Christian, or, give them a denomination, and they'll say, yeah, that's who I am. And these men actually test out with all the toxic stereotypes. In fact, their wives are the least happy. They spend the least amount of time with their kids. They have the highest rate of divorce, even higher than secular men, 20% higher than secular couples. And then the real shocker is that they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, even higher than secular men. And so this is one reason. One reason that Christians have a negative reputation is because people hear about these Christians, or these, ostensibly Christian men, who are taking words like headship and submission, but infusing them with meaning from the secular world. When we talked about how Darwinism has impacted the secular definition, for example, they will take concepts like that and then put it in, under the label of Christian headship, and it's not. It's a secular definition. So the task for the church, by the way, is, on the one hand, how can we really encourage the men who are doing well, who are regular churchgoers, who are committed, and we need to stop scolding them, and tell them that they're doing well, they're running the race, and give them the support and encouragement that they need. On the other hand, is there a way to have a better discipleship program that reaches out to these nominals who are sort of at the fringes of the Christian church? By the way, my students don't know what nominal means, so I have to explain. NOM is Latin for name. So it means people who are Christians in name only. How do we have a discipleship program that reaches out to them and helps them to realize that what they're doing is not biblical, and, bring them into the fold, and help them to acquire a much more biblical understanding of, of a Christian worldview, especially of masculinity.
Oh, it's really helpful. In fact, I conducted a wedding recently where I did the address to the couple after they got married, and I said to them, you can have the best marriage in society or the worst marriage in society. It just depends how seriously you're going to take Jesus.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good application.
Thank you so much for your time today, Professor Pearcey. Just as we close, maybe could you let us know a bit about the Houston Christian University that you work at, and maybe an opportunity for any of our listeners to engage with your work there?
Yeah, but we were talking beforehand, because before we went on air, because our school does do a fair bit now of auditing, bringing in auditing students, and I have had so much fun in auditing students who come into my classroom. There's a panel on the wall, sort of like a computer screen, where they all show up, like a Zoom meeting. It's synchronous, so it's not an online class where you can just take it whenever you want. You do have to show up at a particular time, but then you interact with the students who are in the classroom. They see you, we see them, and they participate just as much as anyone in the classroom. They bring such a richness to the class discussions, because they're coming from all these different countries. We've had them from Switzerland and Philippines, and where else? Australia, Canada, Germany. We've had so many auditing students, and of course, they have to get up at odd hours sometimes to join us. But yeah, I'm glad you had asked me to talk about it, because I think it's a wonderful opportunity. We are finding that there's a lot of people who say, I'd love to know more, but I don't need I don't need to spend money to register and get credits. Well, that's what auditing's for. It's so that you can sit in the classroom, read along with the students what they're reading, join the class discussion, and learn just for your own personal enrichment. And so we're getting more and more people, as they find out about it. Our auditing program is really growing. And, some schools have a lot of online classes. It's not at all the same. No, when you're part of a discussion and you're getting that kind of personal interaction, the dynamics are much, much different from just an online class. So yeah, I highly recommend it. If you go to Houston Christian University and you look for the page on auditing, you will see two words, by the way. We do not fulfill the legal definition of auditing, so we had to come up with a new label, and it's called survey. So it says auditing or surveying students. So look for the word audit survey. Just Google it, and you'll find.
You teach a class on C.S. Lewis, you mentioned earlier.
I'm just finishing that class on C.S. Lewis. We had so much fun. Oh, I'm getting the best feedback on this class because C.S. Lewis, of course, is so profound and such a good writer that he rewards you very well for digging in deeper, no matter what book you read of his, but it's philosophy of. So it's primarily his philosophical arguments. And then Houston Christian University is the only university that has a degree program in what's called cultural apologetics. Cultural apologetics was coined, the term was coined to describe what Francis Schaeffer did, because he didn't look just at ideas sort of in the logical ether, right? Arguments and ideas. He looked at ideas as they percolate down through cultural forms, right? Through art and literature and music and movies. Right. So because that's how most people pick up their ideas about life. They don't say, I think I need a worldview and go sign up at the local university in a philosophy class. They don't do that. They're picking up their ideas through the books they read and the movies they watch and the music they listen to. So it's very important for Christians to have that kind of cultural literacy, that they can recognize worldviews when they come to us, not in words. That's easier to recognize. But when the worldview is expressed, through the plot of a movie, through the composition of a painting, in images and pictures and stories. How do you discern worldviews when they come to us in cultural forms? So we're the only university that actually has a degree program in cultural apologetics. So that's one thing that makes it unique. We get such a wide range of students, because we get very artistic, literary types, and we get very philosophical, intellectual, cognitive types. We just get the whole range. You can tell I'm very excited about it.
Well, I love it. I mean, I could just stay on and just talk to you about this for hours, but I must let you go because I'm sure it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon where you are, or now 2 o'clock in the afternoon where you are. Thank you so much for your time today. It has been an absolute treat and an honor. We will put links to your books along with information about Houston Christian University in the description to today's episode. But God bless you. We should be praying for you and looking forward to reading anything else that you have to write in the future.
Oh, and I should give you my website. I keep forgetting to do that because my publisher just upgraded it, so it's colorful and fun. NancyPearcey.com, and Pearcey is Pearcey. Don't forget the extra E. NancyPearcey.com, and so you can come there also and browse my books, and you can leave a message. I read them. I don't have time to answer all of them, but I'll read them. So come on over and say hello at NancyPearcey.com.
Brilliant. Will do. Thank you, Professor Pearcey.
Thank you. Appreciate it.